Right, well, fantastic to be here. I'm Vicky Moffat, Chief Executive of Chapter Zero, and we're a membership organisation for non-executives and chairs, and we focus on climate change. So our purpose is to equip and inspire directors to lead on climate from the boardroom. Now, I'm delighted to have a very, very impressive panel today, and we've been discussing in the ante-room, and I know it's going to be a fascinating discussion. I'm pleased to introduce Kathy Ryan, Chief Sustainability Officer of M&G Investments, who is leading group sustainability strategy, policy, governance and resourcing. So you must be busy. Kathy began her career in the capital markets and worked with Pioneer Investments, Crédit Agricole and JP Morgan before founding your own ESG investment research and analytics firm, which is called Global Green Investments, advising clients including the World Bank, Carbon Tracker and the UK government. So we're really pleased to have you here today. Thank you. So Cressida in blue in the middle here, Cressida Curtis, Group Sustainability Director at Waits and a member of the Executive Committee. And what's fascinating about Waits is it is actually a private company, so it will be interesting to compare notes across the panel. Cressida worked previously for 3 years at Brunswick, the critical issues firm. She is a member of the Future Leadership Forum Advisory Board, a member of the UK Green Building Council, and a member of the Cities Forum of NLA. So welcome, Cressida. And last but not least, delighted to be here with Rhian Kelly, Chief Sustainability Officer of National Grid. So you can see we're going to have a good discussion with very different organisations. Rhian looks after the strategic objectives, emissions reductions, disclosure and internal alignment. Previously you were Director of Infrastructure at the CBI. So welcome to everybody who's listening today. And we're going to start with our first question to talk about the regulatory regimes and how they're impacting your discussions both at exec and non-exec boards.
Great, thank you. Well, maybe I'll get started. Firstly, to say M&G is an organisation which is 170 years old, has asset management and life insurance capacities, and with 346 billion in assets under management, which spread across public assets and also private assets. For us, sustainability is really built into our purpose in terms of assessing sustainable growth and understanding intergenerational wealth transfer. So maybe in general to say, in terms of regulation, that obviously has been a huge driver for organisations, and particularly in the financial sector. It's been a really key driver. But for us, particularly for the last year, we've undertaken a significant amount of work with our board to update our overall group sustainability framework. Part of that framework is our commitment to climate and our commitment to net zero. So in our asset manager, we made a commitment to net zero back in 2020, and in our asset owner in 2021. And so now being halfway to 2030, it was very important for us to assess how well our progress was moving forward and how we were actually going to ensure that we would deliver on our 2030 interim targets, which are really just a couple of years away. So we undertook a significant piece of work to assess where we are currently across our asset book, and we introduced an updated sustainability climate framework, which enables us to be able to have clear, comparable data across all our asset classes. So what that means is we developed a strategy called our Grow, Align, Reallocate strategy, where we're going to grow assets which we say as critical enablers. We will engage with companies who are on the journey, but we would like to see them move to a better decarbonised state. And lastly, we consider how we will reallocate potentially from companies who face high risk of stranded assets. And for us, it's really critical that we're able to assess with a comparable framework across our entire asset structure how we'll do this. For example, this enables us to be able to assess both public and private assets. And in the public space, we've got some very interesting new funds, our Sustained Paris Aligned fund range, which aligns very well with this framework.
Let's hear from you, Cressida, because would you say that the regulatory regime is a help or a hindrance?
Most definitely a help. So to explain Waits works in the built environment, we've been around 127 years, not quite as long as M&G, but we're still family owned, and we turn over, just for context, about 2.4 billion a year. So we're one of the top 10 contractors in the UK across the public and the private sectors. About half of our revenue comes from public sector contracts. And one of the big shifts that I've seen in the last 18 months has been the introduction of the Procurement Act, which may have passed some of you by. For us, that means that any public sector contract that we tender for now, we have to demonstrate that we are aligned with the 2050 net zero target for the UK, which is phenomenally powerful in my role as a Group Sustainability Director, in just making sure that it is woven into what we do every day. We cannot jeopardise half of our income through not being absolutely on point with this. So that's just one example from me of how I find it really useful.
It's a great example. Do you want to answer that, or shall we go to another question? Did you?
In the interest of time, I'm happy to move. I've got lots to say about regulation, but move on.
Okay, well, we at Chapter Zero work with a leading professor, David Grayson, and he's famously talked about boards of the future and the changing role of directors. And I love his quote. He says that the role of the director is moving from cop to coach and from monitor to mentor. So I'd like to ask you about how you work with your boards, both formally and informally. And perhaps we could start with you, Ryan, if that's okay.
Yeah, I really like the quote about cop to coach and monitor to mentor, because I also use that a lot to describe the role of CSO, actually, because I think in a way you have to mentor the business, you have to be a coach of the business, but there are some times when you actually need to have difficult conversations in the business and say, actually, you said you'd do this, have you? And so I think that, and we discuss it a lot in my team, when do we become the monitor and the cop, and when are we the coach and the mentor? So well, the sorts of ways that we work, so we have a safety and sustainability committee made up of about 5 board members. They meet 3 times a year, so that's perfect opportunity to have an ongoing conversation about sustainability. And I use them in terms of setting the long-term ambition for the organisation. So we have a net zero commitment by 2050. We have short-term targets for 2030. And I then, having set that long-term ambition, I then regularly go back to them with a sort of update on how we're doing against those metrics. I find them quite helpful. I find that one of the things that they bring is we have members on our board who are sitting on other boards and looking at what other businesses do. So there have been times recently, for example, we don't have a climate change policy. One of our board members said, well, I know other people do. We went and looked and we realised that quite a lot of our peers did have it. I think, frankly, we didn't feel we needed to because we were doing it anyway. But as we get closer to 2030 targets, it is a really useful frame. And so we basically use that bit of input from our board member, developed a climate change policy. So I found it very helpful. The other thing that we do, although we have a safety and sustainability committee, we also have an audit and risk committee. And once a year, we get those 2 boards together. And what we do is we get the sort of strategic narrative tracking of setting commitments, monitoring progress against commitments, with the committee that does a little bit more of the nuts and bolts of auditing and looks at disclosures, and so we have an audit where we do financial and non-financial together, but we'll go through and say what's the strategic direction on our disclosures. And it's a really useful conversation because you bring together the sustainability with the audit, and actually at that point we get most of the board, which is also really helpful to discuss, well, what's our strategic approach to reporting, to disclosures, and to thinking through where do we best tell our story externally.
Sounds excellent. Cressida, I know you've also worked with Chapter Zero in the past.
Yeah.
And I'd just like to welcome all of you to invite your directors to join Chapter Zero, which is free of charge, and they can register on the website. But over to you, Cressida.
Well, actually, I'm just going to pick up on that.
Okay.
So I was previously at British Land, which is a FTSE 100, and we had a new chairman come in, and I had my 15 minutes with the chairman. What do you do? And, how's it going? And at the end he said, well, if there's anything I can do, then, do let me know. And I said, well, actually there is something. There are two things. Ask everyone that you meet in the company what's exciting them about sustainability, because if they know it's on your mind, they will pay more attention to it. But the second thing is, could you go to one meeting of Chapter Zero? And he said, what is that? And I said, well, actually, your good friend so-and-so is, one of the founding members, and these people go, and I think you know so. And he was like, oh, this is interesting. And he went and he came back and he was 400 times more engaged with the agenda because he'd been in a forum where his peers were talking about how they were thinking about it. So I'm sorry to be just shamelessly plugging Chapter Zero. Phenomenal if you're trying to get the board to think differently about climate, not just as another thing to manage, but also as an opportunity. So on the side. But how do we work with Chapter Zero? With our board.
Your board.
We have a sustainability committee, and I work very closely with the chair, who's one of our non-execs, to agree. The first thing we did when I came in 18 months ago was to be very clear about what's the board's role on this and what's the role of the executive committee, and just have that absolute clarity. Because the board can play, in my experience, the board can play a really useful role. They don't have to be involved all the time, but they need to set the ambition. And you need to have agreement on what that ambition is. They need to make sure that the agenda items that are being brought to them are what they should be, that are helpful to make sure that we achieve the ambition. And they need to ask really great questions. And actually, that's somewhere that Chapter Zero can be really helpful. But we also work with the audit committee for obvious reasons that Rianne's mentioned. We work with the nominations committee. Are we getting the right people with the right breadth of experience into things like commercial director role or finance director role, and then Remco, because it's 10% of our bonus pot.
Yeah, REM is very important. I mean, this is sounding that climate is embedded almost into every committee, which is where boards are moving towards. But we are suffering headwinds. And would you like to talk about how the headwinds are impacting the role of the CSO? I'm sure everybody in the audience is thinking about this and impacted by the headwinds. So shall we start with you?
Great, thank you for that. Yes, certainly it's been a very interesting year in sustainability. I've been working in this space for over 15 years now, and I would say this year has been probably, obviously for everybody in general markets, are very volatile, and I think the sustainability agenda is definitely embedded in this. But what has been really interesting also is how we work with boards through this period. So Cressida, as you say, really points well made. The board have very different skills, but typically are very expert, bring their own expertise and knowledge to this area, and they all have strong opinions, typically, in terms of how we approach it. I found this year in particular, because we went through this process, as I mentioned, to reset our overall strategic framework for the group, I wanted to work very closely with the board. I started as a relatively new CSO in M&G about 18 months ago. And so in order for me to ensure that I understood very well what their priorities were and also what their ambition levels were, I worked very closely both bilaterally with individuals to do tailored briefings to them in terms of expert advice, I suppose, firstly, providing some strategic advice in where are regulations going, where from a macro-thematic perspective the company is facing some risks with regard to climate, nature, social and human rights impacts and so forth. And then particularly to build that relationship of trust with them so that they would understand that I was putting forward and crafting a strategy which would meet their needs. And in order to do that, so we had very close collaboration in terms of developing the overall framework, which we agreed actually and was put in place in our annual report this year. I'm very happy to say, despite the political headwinds and despite the challenging year, our board were very clear that we are committed to this. We are committed to sustainability and it's how it integrates in our model. And maybe just to back that up, the two key themes we landed on, which the board were very keen to include, were resilient planet and resilient societies, which really includes the work we do specifically on our investments in terms of from early stage capital that we're doing to help solve grid stability mechanisms. So we've had significant investments from Catalyst, our early impact manager, to help solve these problems. In addition, also through our Emerging Markets Impact Manager responsibility, where we invest in, for example, electrical fleets of forklift trucks in Nigeria. So they work very collaboratively with development finance institutions. And lastly, also through regenerative agriculture and extensive investments we have both in Europe and across Latin America in helping to invest in regenerative agriculture and also in that knowledge capacity build across areas.
Fascinating.
I would love to jump in on this, on the headwinds, which it's very easy to be very miserable at the moment if you work in sustainability. Despair is a luxury. Hope is a discipline. And I see us at a really interesting point because in 2008, anyone who is around there working in this field, you may remember that it was just beginning to take off, like properly take off with corporates. And the global financial crisis hit and it just wiped itself off the agenda. No one cared. I'm not seeing that happen this time around. This is a very different type of pushback. And what I think we're doing is the typical team building, forming, storming. We're currently norming. We're getting challenged, quite rightly challenged. Where does this fit? How should we approach it? What the hell does it mean? And what are we not seeing that we need to be seeing? I'm quite happy for us to be challenged. I think there's some of the emotional stuff around it. Well, let's just take it down a couple of notches. But let's have the conversation. I would much prefer to be having the conversation and being challenged on, do we need to do this? Why do we need to do this? What will it actually take? Because most of the people in this room know that it will take a lot more than most of the people out of the room know to make this work. We've got to have the conversation. It's part of the journey, I think.
Rian, let's hear from you.
I definitely want to jump in. So National Grid is 50% UK and 50% in the US, in the Northeast, in Massachusetts and New York. So we're definitely, we're in very progressive states in New York and New England, but there's no doubt there's a feeling, particularly in the US, that I think blows across to the UK. I take your point actually and go back to my time at CBI. I don't know, after the financial crisis, where I at the time was working on climate change and infrastructure. And for a number of years, we just switched and we talked about economic security, we talked about security of energy supply, we talked about jobs. And then, sure enough, it's sort of cyclical, it popped back up again. And so I think that will happen. So one of the things I've been saying to my team is this is cyclical, it will come back. There's no doubt. You can see the impacts of climate change. It's coming back. We're going to have to weather it. But I really like your point, and I've sort of been phrasing it differently. But it's the same point. I think we have to be pragmatic. I think we can't be people evangelizing about saving the planet. That should underpin all of this, but that isn't what's going to win the day. We need to be pragmatic. We need to talk about value in our business. We need to talk about how we're reliable, how we're supporting resiliency, how we're ensuring that we're an efficient organisation, how we're an innovative organisation. And it's the same point, but it's this sort of how do we become more pragmatic?
I think that pragmatism piece is so important. Just a little example. I've got a 14-year-old boy. Obviously he rolls his eyes every time I speak, but getting past that, he doesn't understand why I have this job, why this role exists. He thinks that businesses should not be destroying the planet because that's illogical. And it is the same thing. I would love there to be a point where we don't need to be around. And I think the younger generation have quite a different perspective on this. It's just, obviously we need to act in a sustainable manner. So although we're not shouting about it, or they're not shouting about it necessarily, some of them are, it doesn't mean that it's gone away. It just means they're thinking differently about it.
I might just come in on that because I think it's really interesting, as you say. I think we're in a very different time to 2008, where these political headwinds are hitting us all. But actually, the business already has incorporated this to such a degree that it's not possible to ignore. So, for example, we are seeing renewable energy capacity roll out. As we saw from the IEA in a recent report, it is now the dominant new additional capacity that's been added. So I think it's in the extent of 37% in 2024. It continues to be in the forefront of most cheap, most easily accessible energy. So in terms of the demand we're seeing both for energy development and also from a customer perspective, from what customers are looking for, this is a basic requirement. So I think for boards, it's becoming clear that it's not possible to ignore this agenda. This is like a key part. This is standard business.
And we need to talk about the trade-offs. because there are trade-offs, but sometimes there's a way through. I'll give a small example. We've got a developments business that takes land, gets it through planning, building homes mostly. And one of the opportunities that they saw for value creation was BNG, biodiversity net gain. So these days, when you have a construction site, you have to create more habitats for nature than there were to start with, which is quite tricky. And if you can't, you have to offset it in the local area. And so they have now set up an entire new business that is creating these habitats for nature. They see massive value creation opportunity
Fantastic.
there. But equally, in their core business, we have spent a lot of time working together to go, you do not have to reduce the amount of building you do. But for instance, if you locate it slightly differently on this massive piece of land, you're protecting this area of really intense biodiversity potential, and you're building on the scrubland that's actually got no biodiversity in it whatsoever. Orient it so you get thermal gain. Let's think differently about what you're doing. You do not have to make less money, but you do have to embed different factors within your decision making, and we need to have those conversations about where there are trade-offs and where there are opportunities.
Let's hear from you, Rin. I mean, one of the questions that we're already discussing is the business case, and we see this at Chapter Zero all the time. If climate and sustainability are embedded into core business strategy and central to the business case, which both of you are giving examples of, then actually the headwinds have made things easier. Perhaps the narrative has changed. Let's hear from you.
Yeah, so one of the points I was going to make, I'll do two things. I'll pivot to that question, but just on the previous question, if I may, I was talking about how it's cyclical. I think that's in terms of communications, but the point you started off with is we're not where we were 10, 15 years ago. That's absolutely true. One of the things I see looking across National Grid is how well knitted into the business sustainability is. We have targets, they're knitted into the way we manage our business on a yearly basis, our performance management, enterprise performance management processes. They're knitted into our enumeration, they're knitted into the way we think about risks. So I don't think that was the case 15 years ago. So you can't pull threads, even if you wanted to, and we're not at National Grid, you can't pull threads and it would all come away. It's too embedded. But to the point about the business case, we are a regulated utility. We will need to innovate. We need more grids in the UK. We need more grid capacity in the US. But we also don't want to build what we don't need to build. So one of the things that we're spending a lot of time thinking about is how do we innovate to make sure we build the right amount of pylons and cables and wires, and how do we make sure that we innovate so we get the most out of them. And one of the things I found really helpful is tagging on to that story and making sustainability part of that story. So we invested a small VC fund in California. We put in $500 million, and we're basically looking at small startups with technologies that we can bring into our business and other energy networks to sort of be more resilient, be more innovative, and be more efficient for the future. And there are great businesses we can pick out of that for sustainability. So one of the businesses we've been working with is a company called AI Dash. And what they help us do, we have lots of pylons and wires going through sort of straight lines through very forested areas. Trees fall on our lines, the lines don't work, people don't get power, particularly if there's a storm. So we've been using this innovative technology to give us satellite monitoring of what's happening along our lines. We also used AI to sort of think about what vegetation is growing along the edge of the lines. And what this all does is create a cost case because it's more efficient because we don't cut down so much vegetation. It's more resilient because the trees don't fall on the lines. And it's also good for nature, coming back to biodiversity, because we then start growing more indigenous species along our lines because they grow slower. And so basically what we end up doing, to your point about how do you make the value case, is we say this is about cost efficiency of the business, it's about resiliency of our lines, and by the way, there's a nature benefit. And so I'm finding that knitting them together and using innovation to sort of demonstrate how sustainability add value is for me has been really helpful in sort of telling the story in the business.
Of the examples, yes. Go ahead.
Because I think that's a great example. So for us in financial services broadly, the case is on both sides of the business. So one, in terms of the investments we make, we obviously are considering what's the potential value degradation for companies that are exposed to extreme physical climate risks, where we're seeing quite significant losses in terms of operations or profitability, and increasing lacking of insurance, etc. And on the other side, in terms of clients and in terms of particularly in terms of institutional investors, what do they want and what do they need in terms of their investments? And in both cases, there's quite an interesting evolution in that certainly for us, it's absolutely critical to consider from an investment perspective, have we considered the full range of risks? Are we incorporating it in a systematic manner? And are we ensure across public and private assets that we have considered what the potential value degradation is as we go forward? From the client side, I think we're at a really interesting pivot in the journey actually right now. Whereas in the last couple of years, there's been a broad support from both retail investors and institutional investors, support broadly for sustainability. I think at the moment, obviously, we're seeing some pullback from the US. That's unquestionable, and there's certainly a policy pullback. However, from Asia and Europe, we're seeing a lot of particularly European asset owners double down on this. And so, despite discussions in the press at the moment around withdrawal of these funds, I think in fact what we're seeing is a reevaluation of how particularly asset owners are considering this agenda and how they need to consider for the longer term, particularly if they're pension fund and long-term investors, how do they consider these are very real issues. If you are a 2030 term pension fund investor. So we're seeing some quite significant flows into sustainable and climate aligned funds because of that.
I can jump on that with a bit of a data point actually, because one of the value creation opportunities that we can see is getting far more deeply embedded into sustainable refurbishment of buildings. Buildings generate about 39% of global greenhouse gases. We're a big problem, and we also consume about half the world's natural resources. So we've got to take action on both sides. What we're seeing in the commercial office market in central London, which is one of the most exciting markets in the world, is massive outperformance of greener buildings. So buildings with green certifications. It's almost a resilience play in the capital markets. Over the last 4 years, green buildings have outperformed standard buildings by 44% on total return. That is massive. And when it's green buildings that people want, we should be getting involved with that as developers and contractors who can make that happen. So what we're trying to do is engineer for that and reorient our main construction business behind delivering eventually only the highest performing green buildings. And that's where the link up with value creation comes in, and that's when the board finds it really exciting.
I'm going to build on both your green buildings point, which made me think about the role of networks, but also your point about pivot. We were discussing this a bit before the panel. I think there is probably a sort of slightly a pivot, a reset, a reframing coming. So we're a networks business. Our job is to basically connect renewable energy and take it from where it is being generated into people's homes and businesses. We're probably most people's scope 2. What we have to do is build the capacity so everybody can have clean energy. That means that our scope 3 emissions are going to go up because we're spending, our overall business is planning to spend 60 billion out to FY 2029. We're 1 year into that. We're planning on spending roughly 10 billion a year, a bit more. But that ultimately means we're going to be building more infrastructure, and our scope 3 emissions are going to go through the roof because more spend equals more emissions. I mean, there are things you can do to basically make that more granular and show improvements, but that's essentially the methodology. But I think the reframing is that it's probably in this country's advantage for everybody else to have clean energy. And so actually maybe it's acceptable for some bits of the economy to have more embedded carbon if everybody else gets clean carbon. And so the pivot, I think, is maybe getting to a more nuanced story about the role of each business in playing its part in ultimately all of us getting collectively to net zero.
We've got I'm just conscious of the time, and I'm actually looking for a time cue in the audience, but not seeing one. I think we have to let the audience ask some questions. But we're off now, aren't we? Why don't you each have your last points, each of you, one more, and then we'll open it up to the floor.
I was just going to build on what Rianne was saying, because we have an equivalent opportunity. Scope 3 is 92% of our footprint. It's massive. It's the whole ball game, really. We, in October, bought, get this, a gas installation business for social housing. And you think, my God, why would you do that? because we're going to transform, or we are transforming it into a renewables installation business for social housing to start fitting those heat pumps in the 4 million social homes across the UK. But the scope 3 is going to go through the roof because of that. We'll be taking out gas boilers, putting in heat pumps. Pretty weighty in terms of what that's going to do, which is a problem for us. So I think that more nuanced story is really important.
Maybe just on the more nuanced point, because I think all of these are really critical, and for us equally, across real estate, for example, we also just developed a first net zero office development in Cambridge, Brooklands. We're invested in a multiple electric bus fleet within Thailand. So for us, it's really critical that we recognise, yes, through these investments, we are actually enabling the decarbonisation, but obviously our own finance carbon emissions increase whilst we do that. So for us, actually, in this climate reset that we've just done, what was really critical was that we wanted to think through how do we more meaningfully assess and monitor this. And so in order to do that, we created a transition assessment framework where we're using 8 different data points to be able to assess each company. What is their transition plan? How are they aligning? And that we score these companies more clearly on a scale from laggard to critical enabler, that we understand on a future perspective that they are aligning or they're not aligning. Because I think in the past, predated standards which were really focused around finance carbon emissions, which altered quite considerably for lots of reasons other than decarbonisation, weren't sufficiently meaningful or impactful. So, yeah.
Did you want to have the last word? Okay. Well, thank you. I mean, fascinating conversation in 3 very diverse businesses. I think we can now take a question from the floor. Yes, over here. Do you have a mic? I'm not sure how this works, actually. Well, I'll give you mine. I'll take mine, I think.
There's one coming.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Great conversation. Great to see you, Vicky and Kathy, Crescenda, and Rihanna. So, very quick question. So, I think it's great to see the collaboration has improved massively. Where we see the chief sustainability officers have the working committees on safety and so on. So do you see a way in which we could further elevate the CSO role so that you can be part of the board itself, where a lot of these strategic decisions would happen? And why I say that is, being in the board, you can actually get direct line of access to what are those strategic investments the companies are going to make, to ensure that every large decision has a sustainability eye on it. So any thoughts on how we could even further elevate the CSO in those roles?
I don't know about other companies, but we channel investment decisions through the executive committee. So I'm embedded in those conversations anyway. Is it the same at M&G?
I could give an example actually from Chapter Zero, which I think is a best practice. And it's actually one of our fellows, and I do have permission to talk about this one, who's on the board of Legal and General. And she is on the board, but she is nominated as the climate and nature leader to work with the executive. So that is her job, and she works with Carl Moxley, who's the Global Chief Sustainability Officer there. And we've actually filmed them. You'll see it coming out in the autumn. But there's this really amazing chemistry. It's a really close relationship. They're almost 2 sides of the same coin doing the same job, and I think that's the best practice.
I think that's an excellent question. I might add that certainly in my role, I lead our Executive Sustainability Committee, and that committee is made up of the executives of the group and obviously interact quite considerably with the CEO, who's also a really important person in this agenda item. I think your point to the board is very important, and as a result, the relationship of the CSO and the board is quite critical. And I think for us, actually having both sufficient board time, so having it as part of the standard board agenda on a regular basis, ensures that it is not necessarily delegated to a subcommittee. It keeps it at a significant level of the board, and then in addition enables you to have bilateral conversations with board members ahead of time to ensure that you do assuage any concerns or priorities they may have. So I think this relationship development is critical, but a very good question.
I like what you've said, Vicky. I think I don't conceive a world where the CSO is going to sit around the board. We also operate, but I think the CSO should be part of the group exec and therefore making those decisions, and should be embedded in some of the investment committees where they exist. But I do like the idea of having a champion around the board who then is the key link between the board and the CSO. But what is key is the CSO is part of the strategic decisions and the investment decisions.
I was just going to say that I think, and this is somewhere that Chapter Zero is incredibly helpful in terms of upskilling the board to make sure that those perspectives and the right questions are being asked, and building off the experience of other companies at board level of what are the discussions that are happening in the boardroom. Are they the right discussions? Is the frequency right? And are we making sure that it's not just about risk management, business resilience, very important, but also about the value creation piece? It's so easy to shoot yourselves in the foot if you haven't got that voice in the boardroom. So you're absolutely right. It doesn't have to be a CSO though.
Take another question. There's one here at the front. Yeah.
Thank you for today. I have a question about the role of reporting. So what's the role of reporting in general, in sustainability reporting in general, and in integrated reporting in particular, in meeting the expectations of the board?
I'm going to do sustainability. So we've had quite an interesting journey at National Grid. When I first arrived in this role about 3 years ago, we were doing an 80-page standalone responsible business report covering everything. That was year one. Year two, we needed to reduce it. The board were very clear that actually they were worrying a little bit about over-disclosure, and so we basically took it from an 80-page report to a 40-page report. We went further this year, and I think we've got to the right solution. We embedded it in our annual reports and accounts. It's a standalone chapter, so it's still got responsible business. You can still see a progress update, but it's in 17 pages with all the data tables behind it. And then what we've done, because it's also, and that's just the straight reporting, right? But there's a whole, what I find is, and I'm sure this is the case in your businesses, when you go digging, there's so much great stuff happening. So to sort of tell that story, we've done a lot more digital work, and we tried to make it more human. We've got people talking about what they do. We've got great case studies, and we've put that on the website. So there's a wealth of information. So I feel like we've gone from a sort of quite clunky 80-page report to something that's much more agile, and then by doing it on the website we basically can keep the story live and update it. And so I think the communications then of the wealth of information that's happening across the business is better.
I've got 2 points to make on this. First, I think one of the massively overlooked benefits of the reporting cycle is that it forces the company to look properly at the detail it's putting externally. So I think there is a process piece, which is people complain about annual reports becoming so large, but everything normally that goes in an annual report has been verified. It's been really tested. Do we mean this? Do we stand behind it? Can we evidence it? That's really important. And I also think that it depends what kind of company you're in. So when I was doing this job in a FTSE 100, we had a standalone 50-page report with tables of everything. You could get down to really granular detail. And that was really important in terms of our share register and making sure that we could get to the right answers and people could track the numbers back and had real confidence in what we were doing. And it was, 2016 to 2020, so it was quite an interesting time. And that was huge in terms of building the credibility on what we were doing and putting the numbers behind the value creation opportunity we could see. I'm in a private company now. It's a very different mentality. We still have to do the tracing back of the numbers. At the moment, we're integrated with the annual report. Interestingly, the sustainability section has become so chunky that we're now talking about breaking it out so that the people who are really interested, like all of you in this audience, I can tell, desperate to get your hands on our report, will be able to dig down into the detail, but it's appropriately embedded through all the other sections of the report. So we get the best of both worlds, but we'll see where we land. We haven't quite got there yet.
And you've reminded me that one of the reasons for putting it into our ARA was to show that it was joined up, that it's not this separate standalone thing. There's a corporate strategy and there's a sustainability strategy. It's to show that if you read it top to bottom, you understand. We were considering, do we go one step further and not have the chapter? I think given the context, I think it's very helpful still to have a marker in there somewhere rather than to have to go through and pick out all the sustainability bits. So I think you still need something that says responsible business rather than sentences here and there.
And maybe just to say, so I agree with both. I don't want to extend it. And very similarly, we also have integrated all our sustainability reporting into our annual report for all the reasons mentioned. I suppose one thing to highlight, and we're seeing it now also in the public discourse, obviously we're also having discussions around reducing the level of reporting disclosure required for sustainability across Europe globally. I think greater standardization is helping us, and I think even from the IFRS we've had some quite interesting requirements this week. The PRA, probably all of you have seen, have now come out with very clear obligations for companies to be clear on how are they integrating climate and to be clear in terms of their disclosures. So I think this regulatory obligation in terms of reporting is good, but I actually also agree keeping it in the annual reports as a standard shows clear integration.
And the only thing I would say on the reporting, sorry, we could keep talking about this. My last comment, I promise. If you stand back, there is still probably too many different ways of reporting. And you start going ISO, you start going ISSB, you start doing greenhouse gas protocol, you think of SBTI, and we are then looking at regulation in California, federal government's been pushed into the long grass, separate regulation in New York, separate regulation in Massachusetts. At some point, that's just a burden. And at some point, it would be
Really
nice to get to something
illustration.
that's basically a bit more standard across everywhere.
But I reckon that the same thing happened with finances, right? At one point, we had regional banks everywhere. Everyone reported in a different way, and it all standardised over time. And it's the same process we're going through. It has to. We have to have a standardised way of doing this so that we can compare apples with apples.
But since you brought it up, how can we make sure that there is a connection between financial and non-financial information in annual reports?
Thank you. Maybe what we can do is link that question to the next question here and answer it together in the interest of time. We've had a time check. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ayşe. I am a management consultant and working on sustainability. And my question is not related, is about Chief Sustainability Officer role. We have seen the Chief Strategy Officer role, which has appeared and disappeared into the business. How do you see the Chief Sustainability Officer role evolving in the 5-10 years?
So you can take whichever question you like of the two there.
Well, maybe just to say, in terms of the Chief Sustainability Officer role, I think that certainly ensuring that I really think all companies should have a Chief Sustainability Officer at an executive level to ensure, as we've been saying, they're integrated into the key decisions of the company, obviously, as well as the key business. So it's part of every core strategy. All of the both the risks and opportunities we're talking about are really considering business model change. We all consider how we look at these issues in terms of our own operations, particularly for finance, in terms of our investments or loans, and obviously in terms of our charity and philanthropic work, but it must be a business model change. It cannot sit just in one of those levers. So hence, I think, critical to being part of the executive. Coming back to the question on reporting, I suppose just an addition, I would say, the interoperability. We have been struggling with the interoperability across different geographies for this area. I was very encouraged to see Ed Miliband and others talking about a 25% reduction for sustainability reporting, that they were very much in favour also of helping to reduce the reporting burden. And I've also heard early stage discussions of AI solutions that are actually going to enable global companies like ourselves to be able to report under multiple regimes in a more in a simplified manner with simplified tools, because I think right now the burden is really caused by lack of sufficient tools.
And I'll have a crack at your question on the CSO. One of the conversations you often hear is the purpose of the CSO to basically make its role obsolete. I've never personally subscribed to that, because I think whilst you could have sustainability absolutely embedded across a business, you probably still need a point of contact or a governing mind that basically helps make sure everything that's happening adds up. So I think you can embed it all you like, but if you don't have that person, then I don't understand how you could tell a story and bring it together and make sure it all delivers what it's supposed to deliver. So that's one end of the scale. So I think ultimately it would sit round ultimately should be sitting around the group exec table and being seen as a sort of rightful role place at the table. I think at the other end, the other thing I have a strong view on, and I've seen this happen to a few peers in the US, is what's happened is the CSO role has often gone, or the CSO has gone and done a comms job and done sort of corporate affairs. I have a strong view that there is absolutely the need for CSOs to work very closely with corporate affairs teams. But it is not, being CSO in sustainability is not about comms. It does have a huge impact on brand and reputation, but we do a lot more besides communication, and I think you need to be close to the strategy team, the finance team. You need to be in our business, embedded in the business units. What are we doing in our supply chain? How are we redesigning our substations to have sustainability in mind? What are we doing with all our suppliers? So I don't think sustainability is only a reputation comms role.
Yeah, absolutely. So I sometimes think of this as a sort of full body immersion for the organisation. We have to get every single department. Yeah, I work really closely with the commercial team who are like, does it cost more? Yes, no. And that's where we started from. And now we've got self-selected. They're calling themselves the green commercial team. I love this. These are gnarly, hairy-ass builders who've been doing this for 30 years. And they're going, well, how can we make a difference? The finance team, how can they help out with reporting and get much more smart about how we're approaching this? The operational team, the guys on site, how do they need to be thinking about it? It covers every single part of the organisation. There isn't a single area that my role or my team doesn't touch. So how you then decide that that's not important enough to have someone leading it, I don't know. But,
I think it's fair to say, and I'm sure you'll agree in the audience, that our panellists are in organisations where you're quite far ahead, just giving the Chapter Zero perspective on that. We have, let's take this gentleman here. So I keep going to the front row, so we'll go further back. Thank you.
Hi, just a question about M&A. And when you're purchasing businesses, how has your role, or how has the role of sustainability changed in the M&A process?
Most recently we get brought in. We know a deal's on the table. So once the deal room's been set up, we're all over that. We say what we need to be seeing, and we're sitting alongside the finance team who are going through all the finances. To understand how that business is set up, where it is. Are there any risks? Obviously, the starting point. And can it do what we actually want it to do when we buy it? So we're fully integrated.
We have a couple of minutes just to finish.
I was just going to add to that. Yeah, quite similar. So we have a very extensive due diligence process, and sustainability is deeply embedded in that to understand what currently potential risks and potential opportunities from with a sustainability lens. So key part.
You want to?
No, in the interest of time.
Yeah. Well, it just remains for me to thank our incredible panellists. It's been a fascinating discussion. I wanted more time. I wanted to talk for a long time. I hope you've really found it helpful, and I believe you'll be available mingling for a few minutes if anybody would like to come and ask a burning question. So thank you very much for listening.